and was able to spend time with our personnel here at the derailment site, including our FRA, Federal Rail Administration, and PHMSA, the Pipeline and Hazardous Safety Material Administration, who are engaging with NTSB. Just to be very clear about this, FRA and PHMSA are part of the U.S. Department of Transportation. NTSB is not. They're independent for very good reason. We respect their independence, but we also work with them to make sure that we're responding to their findings and that we're supporting their fact-finding work. I was also able to spend time with a number of federal personnel, including EPA, FEMA, and others who have been doing phenomenal work from day one in order to make sure that this community is supported. That includes, again, not just the presence that our department had from the early hours of this situation, but the presence of public health personnel, environmental personnel, and emergency management response personnel. Spent time with not just federal folks, but state leaders, including Ohio Emergency Management, and local leaders from the county and from the community. Council members and the mayor. Had a good conversation with the mayor, who is clearly very focused on supporting this community and helping the community move forward, as well as other village staff, including the village manager, waterworks leader, and the fire chief. And I just have to say the resilience, the resolve, and the decency of this community as they have gone through both this disaster's immediate impacts and the swirl of national and international and political attention that's come their way. Their decency and resolve has been inspiring. I also want to make sure to acknowledge something that happened yesterday. A plane crash took the lives of 5 people working for CTEH. That is a firm that is involved in this cleanup. I met with some of their personnel earlier today who are mourning the loss of their friends and colleagues, some of whom were involved in this response as they were on their way to another one. And NTSB is involved in the immediate response to that crash. But my heart goes out to the people who are already in a very stressful situation here and are now having this added pain and facing it in a way that, again, is inspiring and moving. I also spoke today with the chair of the NTSB, Jennifer Hamady. As you know, they have released their initial factual report. Their final work on this will take a while to come out. But having these factual findings is an important step toward being able to move on to the phase of policymaking. And while we will, of course, wait for their analysis and recommendations at the end of the full process to make certain judgments, we will not wait for that process to run its course to continue doing everything that we can to raise the bar on rail safety and to hold people accountable. And that's the other part of what my visit here is about, to make sure that we can assess how to drive the best safety improvements across our national transportation system. And to any national political figure who has decided to get involved in the plight of East Palestine, I have a simple message, which is I need your help, because if you're serious about this, there is more that we could do to prevent more communities from going through this. And we've laid out a set of actions that DOT is taking, some of which were already underway, others which we're adding to the agenda. A set of things that the railroad industry needs to do, including better informing communities when hazmat is coming to them, something I've talked to the governor about and strongly agree with him on, and including steps to take care of their workers and their system, and things that we need Congress in order to work on. And again, anyone in Congress who cares about these issues, they are welcome to come to the table and work with us to get things done. So anybody who is interested in that, I'm going to hold them to that. But we're also holding ourselves to the highest standard in terms of the work that we're doing and the work that we're going to continue to do to both respond to this incident and to make sure that we make rail safer for everyone who lives in a community that is close to rail lines and anybody who is involved in freight rail at all. With that, happy to take a few questions. What I tried to do was balance two things: my desire to be involved and engaged and on the ground, which is how I am generally wired to act, and my desire to follow the norm of transportation secretaries, allowing NTSB to really lead the initial stages of the public-facing work. I'll do some thinking about whether I got that balance right, but I think the most important thing is, first of all, making sure that the residents here have what they need. Something that from our piece of the puzzle, DOT, we were working on from day one. And making sure we do something for the future. We can talk about process, and that's perfectly fair. But I don't want people pointing to process as a way to get away from the fundamental questions of rail safety, regulation, and accountability, and whether we're going to make it tougher or whether we're going to allow it to continue being watered down.
Hey, on that note, were you talking regulations on trains carrying chemicals?
Sorry, I just wanted to. So again, in terms of the timing of the visit, I'm trying to strike the right balance, allowing NTSB to play its role, but making sure we're here in that show of support. But in terms of the residents, which is what this is really about, the really striking thing to me is how they're here for each other. Now, this is not a community with infinite resources. Speaking with the mayor, hearing about what he has been through, and remembering the experience of being a mayor, I am really impressed with how they've been able to support one another. And they're not here for the politics. They're here to make sure this community can move forward. Yeah, I spoke with community, two members of the council, spoke with a lot of community residents who were involved in their capacities responding to this. And all of them, I just really admire their decency as well as their resolve. Well, first of all, I want them to know they're not alone. That before, during, and after the national attention, they're going to have support. They're going to have support from us when it comes to holding Norfolk Southern accountable. They're going to have support from the EPA when it comes to making sure they get accurate information about the safety of their air, water, and soil. And I think they can have support, they ought to have support from a whole country that has seen what they've been through, above and beyond the kind of legalities of it. The point is to make sure that they're taken care of for the long run.
Would you tighten regulations so that trains carrying chemicals like vinyl chloride will have to be registered as high hazard flammable trains?
I think that is something that we need to look at. Look, let me be clear about one thing though. These trains were regulated as hazardous material, but they were not in that higher category called high hazard flammable train. That's a category that was created mainly with crude oil in mind. And it was largely a response to the derailment that killed 47 people in Canada in the early part of the last decade. I understand why there's something particularly dangerous about certain kinds of flammable liquid like crude oil. But I think just at a common sense level, you ask yourself, if there's a category called high hazard flammable train, and this train that led to that toxic cloud and that consequence for this community wasn't in it, what's going on there? And so it's one of many things that we're looking at with the authorities we have, but also want to work with Congress on. And also, you know, that 2015 rule that's getting a lot of attention around ECP brakes wouldn't have applied to a non-high hazard flammable train. But I think we got to ask, what other trains should that have applied to in the first place? And can Congress untie our hands a little bit in terms of the hoops we've got to go through to try to raise the bar on those braking rules, because Congress pushed it in the opposite direction, just like the tank cars. I mean, when you see the twisted metal there, you realize the difference between a fortified tank car and some of the tank cars that don't have that level of fortification. The target date for getting that done, changing some of the tank cars, was 2025. It got pushed out, watered down to 2029. Again, I am being careful not to weigh in on what tank car fortifications might have made a difference here, because NTSB is doing that work. But I'm just saying, in general, hazardous materials could be going through communities in stronger tank cars. Let's speed that up. So I'm calling on the railroads not to wait on us making them, and the companies that they work with to require that. But also Congress could help push that date back up. The answer to your question is yes. I felt strongly about this and could have expressed that sooner. Again, I was taking pains to respect the role that I have and the role that I don't have, but that should not have stopped me from weighing in about how I felt about what was happening to this community.
Do you still believe that this is one of just
Sorry, it's really hard to hear.
The third hot bearing detected at 253 degrees before critical failure was alerted. Did the crew do what they were supposed to do? Was the equipment that was used by Norfolk Southern the right equipment for the job? And, I mean, more importantly, could this have been prevented?
Right. So part of that I really have to let NTSB speak to. And by the way, I think they have an availability at 1 o'clock where they'll go into more detail. But what I will say is those hot box detectors represent an example of a piece of safety equipment that right now is not required by regulation. And so there are differences from railroad to railroad, from company to company, in terms of how they're used. I think that's another example of something that needs to be looked at to try to prevent things like this from happening again. Yeah.
This morning I heard you talking with the officials down at the train derailment site, and they mentioned that the placards that said high hazardous materials were plastic and burned right away. For future responses to things like this, and first responders acting quickly, they don't know what's in those train cars. You mentioned common sense earlier. What moves forward, and what did you learn that you could implement going forward?
That's right. That's one of the reasons I'm glad I was able to see this site directly. The moment you see the twisted metal of those tank cars, you understand how a placard indicating the hazardous material on board will not survive for more than a second in the kind of heat that this site created. It's one of the reasons why we called for railroad companies to proactively share more information on the hazardous materials on their trains moving through communities. That goes through a piece of software called Ask Rail. I think we need to raise the bar on what's expected and on what's required. But I think the railroad industry should be doing more out of the gate. Let me mention one other thing. We fund first responders. Matter of fact, through some of our programming, about 4,000 first responders in Ohio alone have been through the training on hazardous material. I think another thing we can do is continue to increase access so that we know they have access to that Ask Rail app and the funding they need and the training they need, as well as pushing the railroad companies to use it and proactively feed their information out there. So first of all, my colleague Michael Regan has made it very clear that Norfolk Southern will pay for this remediation. And the federal administration will be here to hold them accountable for that and make sure that they are making this community whole. Other federal resources include the presence of emergency management personnel, public health personnel. Let me mention one other thing that I saw state public health personnel doing in concert with the county and local leaders, which is making sure that they address the mental as well as the physical health effects of this. Because obviously you've got a community that has been through something that even as the air clears, even if the soil and water and air are continuing to be tested and shown to be clean, that's still going to affect their health in a different way. And I applaud everybody who is paying attention to that side. Sorry, there's a follow-up I just want to... Yeah. Well, that's just why we need to, that's a great example of why we need to make sure we have the strongest, toughest possible hand when it comes to dealing with these railroad companies. And to me, it's both specific to this location, which is that as long as Norfolk Southern is running trains on this track, and as long as anybody is feeling the impacts of this disaster, Norfolk Southern has to be there, not just this year, not just when all the press are here, but every single day. But also, Norfolk Southern and the other freight rail companies need to stop fighting us every time we try to do a regulation in order to hold them accountable and their other railroad companies accountable for their safety record. And what we've seen is industry goes to Washington and they get their way. They got their way on the ECP rule. They got their way on a Christmas tree of regulatory changes that the last administration made on its way out the door in December of 2020. I think they're getting their way on the fines being too low. I'm sorry, but if the biggest fine we can charge on a violation is $250,000 or less, and that's an egregious hazmat violation to get somebody killed, that is not enough for a multi-billion-dollar company. Well, we're acting on it with the authorities we have and calling on members of Congress to act on it with the authorities they have, and the railroads not to wait on us to require them to do the right thing on their own. Well, I will say this. If you talk to the unions representing workers in the rail industry, number one thing they talk about when I'm with them, before they even get to wages and benefits, is safety. And they have weighed in on safety. Matter of fact, again, if you look at the record and comb through the fine print on the December 2020 rulemaking under the last administration, there's a whole bunch of comments from labor on why they were concerned from a safety perspective, and then all of the rationale for why their concerns were overruled. We know that, for example, and this is one of the biggest things we're working on, we know that one safety issue is how many people are on a train. This one had 3 people on it, a trainee and 2 others, according to the NTSB report. And that's actually more than you sometimes get on a mile-long train. The railroad companies want to be able to take it down to 1. One thing that workers have told us, unions have told us, and that we feel strongly about, is there needs to be an actual regulation on this. It was in the works. The last administration froze it. From the moment we got here, we've been resuming the work on advancing that regulation because it's an example of something that workers have been asking about that bears on safety. Again, I will stay out of NTSB's business on whether crewing and staffing, how that might have related to this case. Too early for me to go around making judgments on that. But we know that if you've got a train that's a mile long and something goes wrong halfway down it and you got 1 guy on there, that's going to be a problem. So this is where we've got to make sure that we have enough teeth in our regulations. Some of the things with the hot box detectors are not prescribed in the letter of the law. They're up to the railroad to decide. And I think we need to look at 2 things. One, did the railroad make the right decisions? That's part of the safety investigation. And then 2, should we lay out a little more clearly what those decisions should be so it's not up to them? And that's the regulatory part. Look, again, I'm here for the work and not for the politics. You can sense when you talk to local leaders and local residents that they're getting pretty sick of the politics too. And this national ideological layer that's been added into all of this when they're just trying to figure out if they're going to be safe. And there's no question that there have been enormous amounts of both information and misinformation injected into this situation, none of which is to the benefit of the community when it comes to that misinformation. So I think, so I lost my train of thought. Well, that's what I had to say about that. I guess one other thing. If the same people who want to come here and play political games are the same people who sided with industry again and again and again and watered down rail regulations again and again and again, I want to see where they've had an actual change of heart or not. And if they had a change of heart, I'll take them at their word and we can get work done. Yeah.
What assurances can we Palestine fire, and then when all the newspapers are gone, all the politicians have left, they can actually make it safe and have the town back the way it was?
That's exactly why we're here. That's why we've been here from the first hours of the incident as an administration. And it's why our interest both in what happened here in East Palestine and in keeping our railroads safe doesn't go away when some other hot news story comes into the headlines. We're going to be here day in, day out, year in, year out, making our railroads safer and making sure Norfolk Southern meets its responsibilities. That is a promise, and one I take very, very seriously. So you can see how hard people are working to clean up this site. And again, I met with some of the folks involved in that on everything from the testing to the remediation. And they are doing good work. They need to be supported. If at any moment we see any evidence that Norfolk Southern is backsliding on their commitments, or that anybody is not doing this by the book and then some, we're going to be there with any authorities that we have on the matter, and this whole administration will, because this is too important to let people down. So I want to make sure, get people who haven't asked before. Sorry. Yeah. Well, one thing he could do is express support for reversing the deregulation that happened on his watch. I heard him say he had nothing to do with it, even though it was in his administration. So if he had nothing to do with it, and they did it in his administration against his will, maybe he could. I've got to think that him indicating that this is something that everybody, no matter how much you disagree on politics and presidential campaigns, can get behind. Higher fines, tougher regulations on safety, Congress untying our hands on braking rules, all the other things that go with that. That'd be a nice thing for him to do.
Secretary, how do you keep the companies from stopping to cut corners when it comes to safety? You know, talking to the unions, one of their biggest issues is just the sheer number of in-person safety workers.
Yeah, that's right.
You know, they pointed to how trains like this, there used to be like numbers of safety workers who would like go through and in-person inspect trains before they. How do you get companies from stopping cutting like large percentages of these safety workers?
Look, the reality is this is their entire business model. In the last few years, they have gone into a business model that is about cutting and cutting and cutting and cutting. And what has happened is it's a concern from a safety perspective. It has not made them more effective in delivering freight. We know that from our supply chain issues that we've seen. It has made them wildly profitable. So profitable that in my view, they could meet a much higher safety standard and still be profitable. And that's what really needs to happen next. So, you know, the reality is if their business model is telling them to cut, whether it's cutting corners or cutting people, the only real wall we can put up against that is regulation. And I know the word regulation is not popular with some people, but we need enforcement, we need accountability, and that starts with making sure we have enough teeth in our regulations to actually see to it that that happens.
You've been transportation secretary for 2 years now. How long can you continue blaming the Trump administration?
Yeah. Yeah, look, I'm here focused on East Palestine, but there have been a number of incidents, derailments, and crashes that need attention, and it gives you if you look at the statistics, you get a sense of what we're up against, and specifically with Norfolk Southern, they need to lead the way in going above and beyond, especially after what happened here. They should have been doing it anyway, and some of their remediation responsibilities obviously is more on the EPA side, and I'd have to look to them in terms of what they can require. But what we're going to require is that they meet the highest standard on safety. Yeah. That's right. Yeah, one of the things that I've seen that the environmental folks on the ground here, both the state and EPA, are very focused on is, you know, not just getting through the next day or 2 days, but what happens as water moves through the soil, what happens as soil moves through the area, and what happens to the soil that's being removed. I don't have all of the details on that, but folks are right to be concerned and interested in that. Yeah.
Talking about regulation, regulatory changes, fine changes, these are things that are political to take months to take place, or to change. In the meantime, these trains are going through other communities, in other states, all over the country.
Right.
So anything that the Department of Transportation, the federal government
Yeah, one thing I've ordered FRA to do is stepped up inspection program, what we would call focused inspections on any of the routes that are of particular concern, either because of the nature of the cargo that's traveling there or because of some other community risk. They do a good job to begin with, but what we can do immediately is a level of elevated focused inspection based on what we've learned from this situation. Because you're exactly right. These regulatory processes can take forever. Something that railroad companies have taken advantage of, by the way, sometimes waiting out one administration to see if a more industry-friendly administration will come in and kill them. We're going to work as fast as we can on the regulatory side. We're not waiting for that. We're not waiting for an act of Congress. We're not waiting for a law to change to do the things that we can do with the powers that we do have. They're right to be concerned. Look, some of these issues, health issues, environmental issues, they can last for years. They can last for decades. And there's really just two things I can say. First of all, we will never forget the people of East Palestine, and we will support them with everything we've got. But second, the best way to deal with an ecological disaster is to stop it from happening in the first place. And that's a big part of where my department comes in. And we take that very seriously. It's why we've laid out all those sets of things we're doing, things we want Congress to do, things we expect the railroads to do about that.
And they claim the rail on contaminated soil.
Say again?
Claim the soil that's underneath the rail where the trains are running right now.
Probably better to direct you to EPA for the details on that. But what I will say is my understanding is what you have here is what was needed in order to restore the supply chain and get things moving, but is not the long-term solution in terms of that. And obviously the contamination of the soil will be an issue there.
hazardous materials, and even talked about some of these being phased out. So in Norfolk Southern, did they own these cars? Could they have had better transport vehicles to carry these?
Well, certainly I would urge Norfolk Southern and any other railroad to radically accelerate the adoption of these tank cars. It is a little complex. Often the tank cars are owned not by the railroad but by the chemical company. But the railroad can require that of the chemical company. And we're looking into what we can require of the chemical company sooner, now that Congress kind of watered down the adoption date. So I guess what I'm saying is a both and, right? I think the railroad ought to require this right now, but we're going to make sure we require it on the legal side too.
And of all that, you believe that they used the best equipment that they could have used to haul these chemicals?
I won't weigh in on that until the NTSB has done their work. I think there's more analysis to be done there.
Secretary, talk about what stopped the DOT from, in the 2 years that you've been in office, from revisiting the ECP rule, or for that matter, redefining what constitutes a high hazard.
Well, the top priority we've had on the regulatory side has been this staffing rule. We can't do everything all at once and realize that we would have to sequence the kinds of regulatory actions we take. And the one we were hearing the most about, especially from workers in the railroad industry, is this two-person crew rule. The other thing that makes it hard on the ECP rule is that Congress, remember, it didn't just get killed with a clean shot, so to speak. Congress basically moved the goalposts on the benefit cost analysis to make it very difficult to keep this rule on the books. And then the last administration went ahead and took it down. So I am asking my staff to conduct a stepped-up analysis on anything we may have missed, any angle that we weren't looking at, or anything that, for example, in a benefit cost analysis, might actually change now that we have the data, some of the data from this incident, that would empower us. But look, the cleaner way to do that would be for Congress to untie our hands, so that we didn't have to go through all those hoops to begin with. So I want to make sure we get some any people here. So again, NTSB should speak to some of what happened in particular in terms of the folks on board. But this is why I'm so frustrated that it's taken so much of our energy and political capital just to hold the line on there being two. I mean, the railroad industry wants to be able to have one person on trains that could be a mile long or longer. One. And there was movement to do something about that. Last administration froze it. We are, before this incident, and now we're still doing it, trying to bring that back.
So how big a problem is this crew staffing?
think it's a real issue. And again, especially given the overall business model we've seen from the railroads, which is to cut and cut and cut, including cutting safety jobs, cutting maintenance jobs. The jobs on board are a little more tightly regulated. But if they could, I'm worried that they would.
All right, Secretary, I'm going to jump in. You guys only have about another minute. I want to get to somebody who hasn't asked a question yet. Anyone who has not asked a question. You in the back of the green, please.
So this is a community that, first of all, it's a community full of good people who did nothing wrong. No one in this community asked to be in this situation. And they deserve not just the full force of the federal administration and the state government being there for them, not just Norfolk Southern doing the right thing and paying for the cleanup. They deserve a different level of support, a human level of support. The country should be wrapping their arms around the people of East Palestine, not as a political football, not as an ideological flashpoint, not as a gotcha moment, but as thousands of human beings whose lives got upended through no fault of their own. And I think that includes visits, not just big official visits from the government, but just people who've seen the news and whose hearts go out to the community here and can come here on a day like this when the sun is shining or on a rainy day and shop in those shops and visit those businesses. It is safe to visit here, as all of us can attest, even while we're still making sure that it stays safe to live here. And people deserve that.
Mr. Secretary,
Yeah.
Norfolk Southern created a website in the wake of the change rail. In one of the FAQ sections, it asks of the residents to consider their long-term health effects. They said no based on monitoring data they shouldn't. Do you think this is their way of minimizing liability?
I know they've got a lot of lawyers. I wouldn't speculate on their legal strategy. What I would say is they need to go way, way beyond the legal minimum here. And they need to lead the railroad industry, shifting its posture to stop fighting us tooth and nail every time we try to use the tools that we have as an administration to make freight rail safer.
All right, last question goes to Sir in the please, and that's it.
Secretary, the Department of Transportation is expected to have a ruling in March on LNG transport by rail. Has that decision been made yet? Do you worry that transporting LNG by rail car could lead to an even bigger disaster than this?
So I'm not ready to get ahead of a finalized rule or announcement there. What I will say is that this situation calls on us to re-examine everything that's been underway related to those issues. Now, what we found as we first looked at that LNG rule was that class of rail movement was unlikely, at least in the short term, to happen anyway. Nobody was seeking to use those kinds of cars. But we're setting policy for the long run. We've got to make sure we get it right.
All right.
All right. Thanks everybody for being here.